Go through with it again. There were no differences between group DM as donor milk, okay, leche donada, and the preterm formula in the incidence of infection-related events, the duration of hospital stay, or the number of deaths. Compared with the groups donor milk and preterm formula, those babies who received their own mother's milk had fewer infection-related events and shorter hospital stay. Now, there's a very important point, and Dr. Ziegler mentioned this, but I want to mention it one more time. Let's look at the incidence of enterocolitis here. In the donor human milk group, it was 6%. In the formula-fed group, it was 11%. And in the own mother's milk group, it was 6%. These were not statistically significant at all. The problem is that in order to identify an intervention as having a decreased risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, one generally need group sizes of 300 to 500 babies because the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis is so low. Therefore, almost all individual studies are underpowered to identify a decreased risk of enterocolitis. La siguiente. So in looking at this study, one first of all has to recognize that there's some limitations that Dr. Ziegler didn't mention that I want to point out. First of all, that the donor milk group and the preterm groups received up to half of their own mother's milk, which may have obscured differences. In fact, there was a 21% crossover, switchover of babies between groups. And even more importantly in some ways, that this study was not powered to detect differences in necrotizing enterocolitis. It was much lower, the overall incidence, in the pre-study expectation. Well, I conclude, I know Dr. Ziegler is pretty convinced that human milk and donor human milk decrease the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis. This study is often quoted as evidence that there's no benefit to donor human milk. For that reason, I think it's very important that we continue to do this research. I don't think that this area of research is closed at all, especially as concerning donor human milk. What's ideal comparison is the donor human milk group versus preterm formula in infants who never received their own mother's milk. That's a very difficult comparison to make. However, it is in this study, providing donor milk to infants who had previously received human milk didn't improve the outcome of sepsis relative when adding infant formula when own mother's milk was no longer available. The key part here is that this is infants who previously received their own mother's milk. So this study is important because I think it's widely misquoted in the United States as indicating that donor human milk should be not used because it doesn't provide much data. So I think it's important. If, in fact, the potential cost savings, Dr. Ziegler didn't talk about cost benefit, but I think this is a very important aspect, is looking at the cost and how much does one case of necrotizing enterocolitis cost versus the cost of banked human milk. La siguiente. Okay. This is just kind of a summary slide. More for your own purposes, if we look at AAP recommendations and recommendations from the commonly used textbook, and this is express breast milk. This is express breast milk plus human milk fortifier is commonly used in the United States. Preterm formula is commonly used in the United States. And full-term formula at fixed volume of 150 ml per kilo per day, looking at protein intake, calcium intake, phosphorus, and vitamin D. And I'm not going to go through this in detail. La siguiente. Okay, I'm going to spend about the last 10-15 minutes talking about some details of infant formulas, because again, in looking at this conference, I thought that this was one area that was probably not talked about. Some of this is fairly basic, but I want to make sure that we kind of go through specific infant formula uses. La siguiente. So first of all, preterm infant formula, generally indicated for babies with birth weights less than about 1,800 to 2,000 grams for whom human milk is not available for whatever reason, or in which one chooses not to use human milk. In the United States, it's available in both 20 and 24 kilocalorie per ounce. That's 0.67 or 0.8 kilocalorie per ml. It's available in both low iron and iron fortified, although most of us use the iron fortified version. It's available only as a ready-to-feed formula in the United States generally, and one doesn't need additional vitamins. Again, we don't usually currently in the United States use the low iron version of preterm formula. La siguiente. Now, transitional formulas go under a whole bunch of different names. These are formulas that are designed to be midway between preterm formulas and full-term formulas. In fact, they aren't truly midway between them for all nutrients. They're much more complicated mixtures. In the United States, they're provided as 22 kilocalorie per ounce or 0.74 kilocalorie per ml. The most common indication is for small babies who are going home and being formula fed. That is, babies less than 1250 to 1500 grams. There's a lot of controversy about what weight to use here, and this controversy has to do with issues of cost and a lot of other issues too. We tend to use a weight of about 1500 grams. Other people use a lower weight. Some people use a higher weight, without a whole lot of evidence to support one specific weight or another. Generally, these are used as the baby gets ready to go home. A second indication is a baby who has slow growth on standard formula or a baby who's fluid restricted. These are particularly babies with bronchopulmonary dysplasia, babies with congenital bowel anomalies, and things like that. It can also be used as an initial feeding in bigger babies. This is widely advocated without any data whatsoever to support its use in this population, but it's actually something that goes on all the time. So you just have to recognize that. La siguiente. Soy formulas. I tell my residents that the indications for soy formulas in the preterm nursery are very easy. There are none. So that's easy to remember. It's the same as the indication for lactose-free formulas. There are none. Strictly speaking, that may not be entirely the case. Whether or not they should be used with cow milk protein intolerance is a controversy. We do not recommend them for that purpose. We recommend more elemental formulas for that purpose. It's certainly not recommended if there's a strong history of or suspicion of cow milk protein-induced enteropathy. And the bottom line is that they're not recommended for the use in preterm infants. They find their ways into nurseries. And I'm sure that everyone over here from the United States is smiling because they know they find their way into nurseries no matter what we say. So I'm here to tell you that our indications, and I think, would you agree that your indications for a soy formula are absolutely none? So that's a very easy one to remember. La siguiente. Protein hydrolysates. I've taken formula names out here in this slide rather than the next one because formulas go under different names in different countries, and different formula companies present these things a little bit differently. Mostly in this class we're talking about where our casein hydrolysate formulas. They are lactose-free, they are hypoallergenic, and they have varying amounts of medium chain and long chain triglyceride. They are what is useful for true cow's milk protein allergy. La siguiente. Okay. Having said that I wasn't going to use names, here are the commonly used names in the United States. And the reason I left this in here is because I wanted to point out the differences that are in choosing these formulas is largely related to the fat source. And the percent of medium chain triglyceride is different between these two products. Progestamil is used commonly in babies who have cholestasis. It's commonly, because of the high amount of medium chain triglyceride, it's widely used for babies who have elevated levels of conjugated bilirubinemia. None of these formulas are ideal for premature infants. They all have fairly high levels of minerals, but don't provide necessarily an adequate level of mineral absorption, although the data to support that and to identify that are vastly inadequate, actually. La siguiente. Now, in our nurseries, we have had an invasion of a couple of new formulas, which are highly elemental formulas. These are formulas in which the proteins are made up of 100% synthetic amino acids. They're hypoallergenic. Currently, they're only available as powder. Some of them are available with long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. Others are not. La siguiente. Currently in the United States, widely used for newborns are two forms, Neocate and Elocare. Again, they're all 100% amino acids. The major difference between them is whether or not they have medium chain triglycerides and a significant amount of MCT oil. They are expensive in the United States, to say the least. La siguiente. I want to mention a special use formula that I mentioned briefly before, which is portogen. It's indicated for lymphatic dysfunction. Mostly we use it for babies who have chylothorax. It's almost entirely MCT oil for its fat. It's a concentrated formula. It can be diluted down. It's not recommended as a routine infant formula, but it does have this very special use and sometimes can be extraordinarily helpful in babies with chylothorax. The problem is it's not essentially nutritionally complete, and most people believe that you do need to use some form of essential fatty acid supplementation if you're going to use portogen over a long period of time, although in fact the exact amount you need to use and how best to give it is controversial. We will tend to give a small amount of intralipid intravenously twice a week in these babies. La siguiente. So to summarize, although generally safe, a careful system must be in place to assure the safety and efficacy of new infant formulas and the evaluation of safety risks of existing formulas. Without questions, human milk is the ideal feeding for preterm formulas. Fortification is required for small babies, but we must be aware of infant formulas and use them rationally, understand their risks and benefits, and not just assume that no babies will get formula because they do. With that, once again, I want to la siguiente. This is mother-child care in Sri Lanka, who I visited a few years ago. Once again, I want to expresar mi agradecimiento a todos el equipo aquí por su amistad, su hospitalidad, por toda esta oportunidad de estar aquí. Gracias.